Senator Kovacic.
Thank you, Acting President. I rise today to speak on this bill, which is potentially one of the worst bills I have seen come before the Senate in my very short time here. It is a policy on the run that will likely compound the problem that it is looking to solve. Another reason that this is a bad bill is that the Greens currently have an inquiry running in the Community Affairs Committee, on which I sit and a Green chairs, where public money and Senate time has been expended with a substantive and intense series of submissions and public hearings. This process is not yet complete. As recently as a fortnight ago, we travelled to Melbourne to hear more evidence, spending public money. The tabling of that report is due within the next few weeks. Yet for some reason, the Greens have decided that they are not going to wait for the outcome of this inquiry and are going to run with this bill instead. They are not going to wait for the outcome of that inquiry. In my view, this is disrespectful of the Senate process, but more about that later. I was reading through this bill and got through the first 4 items, and I thought to myself, well, this isn't too bad, not much to see here. It's just tweaking some definitions and some titles, but nothing really out of the ordinary. And then I turned to item 5. It is here where we see the true colours of the Greens come through, akin to the scary red flag of Stalin. Again, a little bit more on that later. Stay tuned, stay tuned. The Greens have put home ownership in the too hard basket. The Greens would probably rather see the big super funds or big investment firms like BlackRock and Vanguard and others own your home for you, but protect your rights as a tenant. But pretend to be considerate of you in that with these faux protections, pushing young Australians away from home ownership into state and institutional-owned housing. But I digress. Turning to item 5, and let's have a look at what this requires the state governments to do in order to receive housing funds from the Commonwealth. And bear with me as I read directly from the bill. Rental prices of existing rental properties must not exceed the price the property was rented at on 1 January 2023 for a period of 2 years beginning on the agreement commencement date. In translation, that means a rent freeze for 2 years. Next, if the tenant of a rented property changes after the agreement commencement date, the rental price must not exceed the price the property was rented on at 1 January 2023 for the duration of the period. So that means the rent freeze remains in place even if there is a change of tenant. So if your tenant goes, you still have a rent freeze on the property that you own. Okay, next. If a property is substantially renovated after the agreement commencement date and rented, the price the renovated property is rented at must not exceed the median rent price for a property of the same type in the same postcode as the renovated property for the duration of the period. So that means, for example, if a mum and dad investor goes to the bank and borrows $150,000 for some basic renovations for their investment property, they cannot determine how much they can rent it for when they are done. A very special formula cobbled together by Comrade Senators McKim and Faruqi will make that decision for us. They will make that decision for Australian mum and dad investors. So next, wait, there's more. If a property was not rented on the agreement commencement date and is rented after the agreement commencement date, the price the property is rented at must not exceed the median rent price for a property of the same type in the same postcode as the property for the duration of the period. This I had to read a few times to understand. And I like to think I have at least a basic knowledge of housing and the property market. But what this means is if you currently live in a home that you own and you decide to move somewhere else, like moving with your partner or your financial circumstances dictate that you should go to a smaller property and you're going to go rent yourself, you can't decide how much you can rent your house out for, even though you've never rented it out before. But don't worry, the Greens have another special formula for that one too, so we shouldn't be worried. After the period mentioned in subparagraph 1 that I read out earlier, increases to rental prices are limited to a maximum of 2% every year. So regardless of your costs, regardless of the inflationary environment, a maximum of 2% every 2 years. Next, a ban on no grounds evictions, including at the end of a fixed-term tenancy agreement. So this means when the tenancy agreement ends, so this is the agreement with you, a mum and dad investor, and your tenant, the agreement is finished, you can't ask the tenant to leave, even though your agreement is finished. Okay. Okay. A ban on
Order. Senator McKim, I just called order twice.
A ban on sale of premises evictions. So this means if next month you suffer the 13th interest rate rise since the Albanese Labor government came into power and you can't afford the repayments on the property and you need to sell it, you can't ask the tenant to leave so you can do that. You have to sell the property with the tenant in place and hope that you can manage that with them whilst you also manage the stress of not being able to afford your loan repayments. And finally, there's a comment that says, and any other matters set out in the designated housing agreement. So we don't have enough time to go through that. Clear evidence exists, as noted by Senator Billick, that there are many consequences of rent caps and freezes making housing markets much worse, further perpetuating the problem. Senator Faruqi ironically raised New York, the most expensive housing market in the world, as a shining example of rent caps and rent freezes. I'm confused. At the public hearing in Melbourne, Mr Coates from the Grattan Institute had this to say: with rent controls in that way, there are a few things that happen. One is that you risk reducing the quality and quantity of housing that's made available in the long term. Secondly, you create a misallocation of the housing stock. That means you need much more housing in order to provide the same level of housing to each member of the community. So in a world where you have strict rent controls, where people are not required to bear the full cost in the long term of what housing is actually worth, they will hoard it. They will live in a home that's got 2 extra spare bedrooms or 3 extra spare bedrooms. And this tends to have generational effects, where those that are around when the rent control is first established do very well, and that those that come in future generations, say younger families, looking for a property. That is why I'm somewhat stunned, as I alluded to in the beginning of my contribution, that the Greens are moving this bill whilst we are in the middle of a Senate inquiry into the very same topic, an inquiry one of their senators is leading and chairing, before the committee has reported back to the Senate with its findings. Is there something that they are worried about? Perhaps the inquiry they have called won't yield the results that they want. This bill from the Greens demonstrates a complete and utter detachment from reality and a lack of understanding of the commercial practicalities of the housing system, the private rental system, and the damage that it would cause to it. There is little doubt that the implementation of the measures contained within this bill would drive Australian mum and dad investors out of the rental market and open the door to institutional investors, further depleting home ownership by Australians. So let's think about that. The Greens want to drive the opportunity of home ownership away from individuals and redirect that opportunity to institutional investors. And they don't care if these institutional investors are domestic or foreign-owned. We definitely don't need foreign institutional landlords in the place of mum and dad Australian investors. The Greens are happy as long as we entrench Australians into being tenants rather than providing opportunities for them to become homeowners. Now Acting Deputy President, I'd hoped that we'd left some of these Stalinist policies like this one back in the 1950s. But no, the Greens' obsession with ultra-progressive regressionism doesn't stop with item 5. Item 6 is, as outlined in the bill's explanatory memorandum, a measure which called for in the 1937 Royal Commission into Monetary Banking Systems. 1937, I actually double-checked in case there was a typo. The Greens are invoking a 1937 Royal Commission in their explanatory memorandum in 2023, some 86 years later. We have come so far and so many changes to the banking and monetary system in Australia since then, such as the internet, online banking, globalisation, but clearly we haven't come far enough that the 1937 Royal Commission is now a timeless document, and I thank the Greens for bringing it to my attention and to the attention of the Senate once again. I'm sure that I speak for all senators here today when I say that the 1937 Royal Commission into Monetary and Banking Systems should be at the forefront of our deliberations when it comes to monetary and banking policy. And forgive my descent into sarcasm, but I'm really annoyed by this bill. Why? Because, again, a committee that I sit on as a senator in this chamber has spent public money, has spent Senate time to set up an inquiry and public hearings across this country during a cost of living crisis at the behest of the Greens, and now the Greens don't wish to wait a few weeks for the outcome of that process. But I'm sure that the Greens know, like their colleague Senator Rice, whom I sit on the Community Affairs References Committee with, that the only committee with the Greens chair that I'm very passionate about housing. And I do commend the Greens for worrying about renters' rights and the imbalance that can sometimes occur between those that own and those that rent. And it made me think about how many people in this chamber are in tune and understand the importance and benefits of home ownership, particularly into retirement. I spent some 2 decades helping people plan and achieve their goals of owning their own homes, setting up financial security for themselves and their families. And I know that the senators sponsoring this bill also know these benefits. But on doing a little bit of research, I quickly discovered that both Senators McKim and Senator Faruqi each own 4 properties. Yes, you heard me correctly, 4 properties each. This includes residential property, a holiday home, which I'm sure is very lovely, and some investment properties. Now, I know what you are thinking, Acting Deputy President. Why would such fierce advocates for renters own so many properties directly contributing to the housing crisis? Well, that's not for me to answer, but leads directly to the main issue that nobody in the Greens is talking about, and that is supply. This is not just a rental crisis, not a housing crisis, but a home ownership crisis. And this crisis has many moving parts to it, not the least of which is the current cost of living crisis, which has seen the cost of new supply soar as inflation has gone unmanaged. Another factor to this issue of supply is the prolific NIMBYism of necessary and sustainable development in metropolitan areas, and with councils, particularly in New South Wales, being the most prolific. Which are they? Green councils. And not just a problem in New South Wales, it is also a problem in the federal seat of Griffith, home to some of Brisbane's wealthiest residents. In April of this year, the AFR reported that the Greens housing spokesperson, the member for Griffith, opposed the development of 1,300 new homes in his electorate. We need to build more homes. We have a supply crisis, and they need to be in everyone's backyard. This is a collective responsibility. Thank you.